BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Zeb Soanes. Good evening. A mother and stepfather must each serve nearly 30 years in prison for the murder of a 5-year-old boy whose battered body was found in a river, dumped to court herd like fly-tipped rubbish. A 14-year-old boy was also jailed. A juror at the trial has called for more support for those chosen to try distressing cases, saying she had been traumatised by the evidence. Boris Johnson has said spending on defence is to increase so it reaches 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. Ukraine says it has forced Russian troops to abandon Snake Island, one of the first territories to fall to the invaders. Moscow said it had withdrawn as a gesture of goodwill. MPs should not be allowed to bring babies into the House of Commons for debates, according to a review of parliamentary rules. The mother and stepfather of a 5-year-old boy have been given long prison sentences by a judge at Cardiff Crown Court for murdering him and dumping his body in a river at Bridgend in South Wales. The man's 14-year-old son was also convicted in the death of Logan Mwangi. Angharad Williamson, who's 31, will serve at least 28 years. Her 40-year-old partner John Cole received a minimum of 29 years in prison. Cole's stepson Craig Mulligan was given at least 15 years. Our Wales correspondent Hull Griffith reports.
A playful, kind, caring boy, Logan Mwangi's life was cut short by those who were meant to love and protect him. The 5-year-old was subjected to cruel and brutal treatment within the walls of his family home. Frustrated by his boisterous behaviour, he was beaten by members of his own family, leading up to an attack in July last year, which left him with fatal internal injuries of a type normally only seen after a car crash.
My son's not here, my poor Corinne's not here!
Take a breath, because I can't understand you when you're crying. Who's not there?
Logan!
His mother, Angharad Williamson, made this 999 call hours later to claim Logan was missing. In fact, she, her partner John Cole, and Cole's stepson, Craig Mulligan, all worked together to move his body in the middle of the night. After the sentences were handed down, the senior investigating officer, Detective Inspector Leanne Rees, read a statement on the steps of the court.
It is incomprehensible that Logan had his life cut short in such tragic circumstances at the hands of those very people who should have been there to protect him. For Logan's father Ben, who stands beside me, today's sentences are welcome news. However, no amount of justice can bring Logan back or compensate for the grief that continues to be felt.
While the criminal investigation is at an end, what led to Logan's death is still the subject of a child practice review. The 5-year-old was known to social services, but a month before he died, his case was downgraded from being a child at risk to a child in need. A social worker who came to check on Logan in the days before his death was prevented from seeing him after being told he was self-isolating. There are still questions to be answered of whether more could and should have been done to protect him.
A juror in the 12-week-long trial says she was so traumatised by the evidence that she suffered recurrent nightmares and was signed off work for more than a month. Dr Jocelyn Sellen has told the BBC that jurors need more support. Our Wales correspondent Thomas Morgan has more.
Jurors can be anybody and everybody, members of the public summoned to deliver an impartial verdict in a court case. In this murder trial, the 12 jurors sitting at Cardiff Crown Court heard harrowing evidence of how Logan Mwangi's mother, Angharad Williamson, stepfather John Cole and his 14-year-old stepson Craig Mulligan beat and killed the 5-year-old before dumping his body like fly-tip rubbish. The evidence jurors heard regarding the extent of Logan's injuries was detailed. They had to watch blurred body camera footage of his body being found. At times, the trial was paused as jurors, including Dr Jocelyn Sellen, struggled to come to terms with the brutality of what had happened to the young boy. Dr Sellen is a psychologist, and she told the BBC she's been traumatised by the evidence. She's called for more support for jurors dealing with distressing cases.
Nightmares, intrusive thoughts, difficulty sleeping, or I see children, it will still take me back. All it would take would be one person, one therapist, one person who's trained in trauma therapy, who is able to understand the nature of that kind of evidence.
A spokesperson for Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service said it recognised the importance of well-being throughout the jury process, adding that a range of support such as counselling from GPs and advice from the Samaritans was available. At the end of this case, Mrs Justice Jefford thanked the jury for their exceptional public service and said she recognised they had endured very unpleasant and emotional evidence.
A meeting of NATO leaders in Madrid has ended with pledges of more financial aid and weapons for Ukraine and renewed calls for President Putin to end the invasion. The Secretary-General of the alliance, Jens Stoltenberg, insisted that Ukraine must prevail as an independent state, but hit back at suggestions that NATO's actions were partly to blame for the conflict. Boris Johnson said he would increase the UK's domestic defence budget by tens of billions of pounds in response to the threat posed by Russia. Our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, was at the meeting.
NATO leaders have concluded this summit in an ebullient mood. The way is now clear for two important new members to join, Sweden and Finland. Those pushing for greater military commitment to Ukraine and bigger defence budgets, and that includes NATO Secretary-General, have got what they wanted. One of the loudest voices in support of both has been that of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
In our case, that means meeting and being prepared to exceed the target we set for ourselves a decade ago of everybody spending 2% of GDP on defence. The logical conclusion of the investments on which we propose to embark, of these decisions, is that we will reach 2.5% of GDP on defence by the end of the decade.
NATO's new strategic doctrine has been updated in the light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It calls Russia a direct threat to Western security, and it's reacting by reinforcing its eastern borders. Britain is allocating an extra 1,000 troops to Estonia, plus making one of its two new aircraft carriers available to NATO's Rapid Reaction Force. That force is set to rise from its current 40,000 troops to more than 300,000. America is boosting its military presence in Europe, while President Biden told the summit that Western economic pressure was starting to have an effect on Russia.
They're going to have trouble maintaining oil production because they don't have the technology to do it. They need American technology. And they're also in a similar situation in terms of their weapon systems and some of their military systems. So they're paying a very, very heavy price for this.
Russia, not surprisingly, has been deeply critical of NATO's expansion. The accession of Finland adds a new 800-mile border with a NATO country. I asked the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg what he'd say to those who might view NATO's position on Ukraine as provocative.
This idea that NATO has some kind of responsibility for the war is absolutely meaningless. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. They have made their decisions. We are 30 allies that have made our decisions. None of that is an excuse for President Putin to invade another country. I mean, the core of this matter is that President Putin doesn't like a free, democratic, successful nation at his borders.
For now, this summit has been all about unity and resolve, a determination to push back against Russia's unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation. But once the leaders go home, domestic priorities may take over, and it's unlikely that every ambition declared here in Madrid will be fulfilled.
The increase in UK defence spending announced by Boris Johnson comes after calls from the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace for a bigger budget. The Prime Minister said the cost of freedom was always worth paying. Our political editor Chris Mason, who is flying back from Madrid with the Prime Minister, looks at the financial and political impact of his pledge.
After a public and pretty noisy debate over defence spending this week, a striking sentence from the Prime Minister. The logical conclusion of the investments we propose to embark of these decisions is 2.5% of GDP on defence by the end of the decade, he said. This is well above the 2% of GDP, national income, requested by NATO of its members, a proportion many miss, and above the current UK proportion, around 2.3%. I'm told the goal could mean an extra £55 billion in total for defence, based on current projections of how the economy might grow over the next 8 years. Other sources acknowledge, though, that the precise number can't be known, nor the final costs of various projects, or what will be set out at big decision points between now and then, what are known as spending reviews. But the Prime Minister will hope it can quell at least some of the grumbling within his government and beyond from those fearful not enough was being promised to keep us safe.
Russia has withdrawn its troops from a Ukrainian island in the Black Sea, which it captured at the start of the war. Ukraine called it a strategic victory, saying the soldiers left Snake Island in haste because of missile and artillery attacks. But Russia said the departure was a gesture of goodwill to show that it was not hindering efforts to export food from nearby Ukrainian ports. From Kiev, here's Nick Beak.
It may be a tiny rocky outcrop, but Snake Island's recapture is a big strategic and symbolic victory for Ukraine. Russia's seizure of the island in the early hours of the invasion in February led to an effective blockade of Odessa and meant exports of the vast majority of Ukrainian grain were impossible. But military analysts said the occupying forces were sitting ducks, and Ukraine says it's now forced the Russians to leave. But Igor Konashenkov, a spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Defense, said their departure was a gesture of goodwill.
This demonstrates to the world community that the Russian Federation is not impeding the UN efforts to organize a humanitarian corridor for the export of agricultural products from the territory of Ukraine.
That explanation has been dismissed by Ukrainian officials. With Russian warships still dominating the Black Sea, experts believe the recapture of Snake Island won't have an immediate impact on the grain crisis. But Brigadier General Alexei Hromov of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said efforts were ongoing to improve the situation.
As for the ships with grain, the armed forces of Ukraine will do everything to stabilise the situation so that ships will be able to have safe passage through the territorial waters.
This latest battle is unlikely to have a significant effect on the wider war. Russia is still gaining ground in the Donbass, in the east of Ukraine. The UK, US and other Western countries are increasing their supply of weapons and their size. But so far not enough have arrived to stop the Russian advance.
An investigation by police watchdogs has found systemic deficiencies in the way some forces in England and Wales deal with allegations of domestic abuse against their own officers. The probe found there was not enough focus on the need of victims and that misconduct cases were not always handled appropriately. The inquiry was launched in response to what's called a super complaint by a campaigning charity. Our Home Affairs correspondent, June Kelly, reports.
The Centre for Women's Justice launched its super complaint because of concern over the way forces were dealing with allegations against officers and support staff. The case studies gathered by the charity included one in which a woman who'd gone to the police discovered that her statement had been seen by her husband, who was the suspect. Impartiality of investigations was among the areas where the watchdogs found failings. One of the organisations behind the report is the College of Policing. Its head of crime and criminal justice is Dave Tucker.
The report is hard-hitting. We didn't shy away from saying where we'd found problems, and now we've got to the end of our investigation and we've got our recommendations that, combined with the commitment of police officers and police forces, I think we've got a real opportunity here to make a substantial difference, and victims should be confident that they can come forward and get the protection and help they need.
The watchdogs said research showed that the charging rate for police personnel accused of domestic abuse was just 9%, lower than the national figure of 11%. The report says where there are no criminal charges, there should be improvements in internal misconduct investigations. While the watchdogs make a number of recommendations, they say it's only in certain cases that an investigation should be passed to an outside force.
The Wiltshire Police Service has confirmed it will be placed in special measures next week, becoming the sixth English force to be judged by regulators as failing to provide an acceptable service. The UK's largest force, the Metropolitan Police, was put into special measures earlier this week after a series of scandals. The others are Greater Manchester, Cleveland, Gloucestershire and Staffordshire. A former MP has been jailed for 2 years after being found guilty of embezzling nearly £25,000 from two pro-independence groups in Scotland. Natalie McGarry represented Glasgow East for the SNP from 2015 to 2017. Our Scotland correspondent James Shaw reports.
Natalie McGarry was the treasurer of two pro-independence groups between 2013 and 2015. Last month, a jury found her guilty of embezzling nearly £20,000 from the campaign group Women for Independence and more than £4,600 from the Glasgow Regional Association of the SNP. Some of the money was taken after she became an MP. McGarry's bank records showed that crowd-funded donations to Women for Independence were transferred to her personal account. She appeared to be using the money to pay her rent and to repay loans. She also spent some on a holiday. Passing sentence, Sheriff Tom Hughes said McGarry had betrayed people who'd put their trust in her. He said society had the right to expect the highest standards from those who sought and eventually achieved high public office.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far. A mother and a stepfather have been jailed for nearly 30 years each for the murder of their 5-year-old son, whose battered body was found dumped in a river in South Wales. Boris Johnson has said spending on defence will increase to 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. Still to come.
I've always quite liked the idea of rugby league. My long-standing memory is that 2003 drop goal. Wow, what a moment that was.
Oops, wrong code horror. The minister in charge of sport confuses her union with her league. A review of House of Commons rules has decided that MPs should not be allowed to bring their babies into the House of Commons chamber during debates. But the cross-party committee did say discretion could be exercised sparingly. Our political correspondent Ione Wells reports.
The committee found the long-standing practice of not allowing babies in the chamber should not be changed, but that discretion could be exercised sparingly. The Labour MP, Stella Creasy, said she had hoped the review would make parenting and politics possible to mix. Writing in the Guardian newspaper today, she also said a lack of adequate maternity and paternity cover for MPs meant the alternative to taking her children into work in the past was her constituents going unrepresented, and feared this would mean the public felt they couldn't elect women. The Conservative MP, Karen Bradley, who chairs the committee, said they did not want people to feel pressured to bring their babies in.
There was a real fear that people would feel obliged. And those very precious few weeks of having a new child and a new person in your life, members wanted to be able to spend time with that new person and adjusting to being a new parent, and didn't want to feel any obligation to come here with a child because that was something that was becoming the norm.
But the SNP's Kirsten Oswald said the system needed to be examined so people from diverse backgrounds or younger MPs did not feel excluded from politics. She said babies would not disrupt proceedings.
I hear what the Right Honourable Lady says about, perhaps babies being a disturbance. I'm paraphrasing her in the chamber. But I have to say, having sat here for a number of years, there are an awful lot of honourable members who I think disturb us all significantly more than a baby or a small number of babies.
The committee said there had been several occasions when MPs had brought babies into debates without disruption, but said it had contributed to some confusion and a gap between the practice and the rules.
The London Regional Director of Health says anyone with symptoms of monkeypox shouldn't attend Pride events this weekend. Professor Kevin Fenton said gay and bisexual men, who make up the majority of cases in the current outbreak, needed to watch out for unusual rashes and fevers. Our global health correspondent Naomi Grimley reports.
This year's Pride is taking place against the backdrop of a monkeypox outbreak centred on London and concentrated overwhelmingly in gay and bisexual men. The virus has circulated in West and Central Africa for decades, but the cases in countries such as the UK seem to be connected, at least for now, to transmission through sexual networks. That may yet change, as any close contact with an infected person can spread the virus. But London's Director of Public Health, Professor Kevin Fenton, says people need to be particularly aware of symptoms ahead of Pride.
If you think you may have monkeypox with blisters, fever, swollen glands, please don't go out over the weekend. Stay at home, contact NHS 111 or your local sexual health service for advice. If you are out and socialising and mixing, please be on the lookout for any signs and symptoms.
Professor Fenton said it was too early to say whether the virus was going to become established in the UK, but that numbers were expected to increase in the foreseeable future. Those who have the virus have been given extensive advice about infection control while they isolate. One concern is that medical dressings don't end up in domestic rubbish, which rats might find, as rodents are the main spreaders of the virus in Africa.
French police say they've made a series of arrests in connection with the sinking of a migrant boat in the English Channel in November last year, in which at least 27 people died. 13 men and 2 women were detained earlier this week. 5 were later released without charge. French media says the rest are likely to be placed under formal investigation on charges of involuntary manslaughter and people trafficking. The US Supreme Court has imposed new regulations that will limit President Biden's power to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In a 6-3 ruling, the court found that the Environmental Protection Agency did not have the authority to set broad caps on emissions from existing coal power plants, which produce nearly 20% of all electricity used in the United States. From Washington, here's our North America editor, Sarah Smith.
This ruling is a major setback for President Biden's plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and tackle climate change. 19 mostly Republican states were worried that the Environmental Protection Agency would force them to move away from using coal for power generation. The Supreme Court has decided the agency cannot do this unless Congress votes to clearly say it authorises this power, and it has already rejected plans to limit carbon emissions. As the court reached the end of its current term, the last item of business was the swearing in of a new justice, the first African-American woman to sit on the court, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Are you prepared to take the oath?
I am.
She was nominated by President Biden to replace a retiring judge who was also viewed as a liberal. So Ms. Jackson's elevation will not change the political balance of the court, which currently has a 6-3 Conservative majority.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day down 143 points at 7,169. On Wall Street, a short time ago, the Dow Jones was down 65 points at 30,964. On the currency markets, the pound is trading at $1.21.8, and against the euro, sterling is at €1.16.2, and that makes the euro worth 86.1 pence. 2 professional female cyclists say transgender athletes are still competing in women's events, despite British Cycling suspending its inclusion policy in a bid to stop this from happening. The government has urged all governing bodies to ensure women's sport is reserved for people born of the female sex. But supporters of transgender rights say that is extremely damaging. Our sports correspondent Jane Dougal reports.
The 2 women are British number ones in their respective categories and say they have lost ranking points and prize money after losing races recently to trans women. That's despite British Cycling's suspension of its inclusion policy for trans athletes back in April on the grounds that it was unfair on all women riders. Both female cyclists, who wish to remain anonymous, have written to the sport's governing body.
I felt totally destroyed because I should have, as a biological woman, had that place on the podium.
British Cycling now says the policy only applies to new applicants for a licence, but the female cyclists say that was not mentioned until they complained, and that detail is not on British Cycling's website. These revelations come in the week the government asked sports bodies to follow swimming's decision in banning trans athletes from women's categories. That has prompted an outcry from trans allies such as Richard Hearn, the chair of the LGBT cycling group Pride Out UK.
Excluding people from the category that they identify as, I feel is extremely damaging. We need to be making sure that trans and non-binary people feel welcome in sport at every level.
British Cycling is yet to publish its reviewed policy on trans inclusion. The female cyclists say they just want clarity for everyone.
After some disappointment for the home crowd yesterday, 3 British singles players have secured their spots in the 3rd round at Wimbledon, with the possibility of a 4th to come. Rafael Nadal is currently in action on centre court. Our sports news correspondent Laura Scott brings us the latest live from the All England Club.
8 minutes was all Heather Watson needed to book her spot in the 3rd round today. The British number 4 had been on the brink of victory last night when bad light stopped play, and it was a case of blink and you missed it as she broke Wan Qiang's serve immediately to get over the line. On centre court, the British wildcard Katie Boulter staged an enthralling comeback against last year's runner-up Karolina Pliskova to reach the 3rd round of a Grand Slam for the first time in a particularly poignant win.
My gran passed away 2 days ago, and I'd just like to dedicate that to her today. It's a dream come true for me. I've got hopefully many more matches to play, and if I can have you guys behind me for those, then hopefully I can go a long way. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Another player entering uncharted territory will be Liam Brodie. He lost 11 games in a row in a battle with Argentina's Diego Schwartzman. But after beating the 12th seed in 5 sets, he joked, "It was easy, wasn't it?" Earlier, there were defeats for 2 other Brits, Alistair Gray and Harriet Dart, while Jack Draper has just got underway. Rafael Nadal is currently 2-1 up against Richardus Berankis, and the world number 1 Iga Swiatek dropped a set but has now won 37 matches in a row.
Laura Scott, in cricket, the weather ended any chance of a final day test victory for England's women against South Africa at Taunton. The match was drawn with the tourists on 181 for 5 in their second innings, a lead of 48. And Jos Buttler has been officially named as England's new men's captain for T20 and one-day internationals. The 31-year-old wicket-keeper replaces the World Cup winning captain Owen Morgan, who retired from international cricket this week. The Culture, Media and Sport Secretary Nadine Dorries has confused the Rugby League and Union codes during a speech at a Rugby League World Cup event. Ms Dorries suggested that Johnny Wilkinson's winning drop goal for England in the 2003 Union World Cup final was a triumph for League. She later accepted she dropped the ball, as our sports correspondent Andy Swiss reports.
From the moment it began back in 1895 by breaking away from rugby union, the sport of rugby league has been proud of its distinct identity. So when Nadine Dorries was speaking at a Rugby League World Cup event in the game's heartland of St Helens, fair to say eyebrows were raised when she said this.
I've always quite liked the idea of rugby league. My long-standing memory is that 2003 drop goal. To reveal a secret, I think we were drinking Bloody Marys at the time. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, but wow, what a moment that was.
Just one small problem. That drop goal, which clinched the World Cup, was struck by Johnny Wilkinson of England's rugby union team. Ms Dorries, who was once a nurse in Warrington, another proud rugby league town, admitted in her speech that she wasn't an expert on the sport. But one audience member, Billy Vaughan, from the local club Portico Vine, was less than impressed.
I thought it was comical. No detriment to her as an individual. Somebody writes that speech for her. They just need to do the research a little bit better. It was all based upon kick and clap, rugby union. We're a rugby league team.
Nadine Dorries later tweeted that she may have switched codes in her speech, comparing herself to Jason Robinson, the England star who played in both league and union. In her earlier speech, Ms Dorries had said rugby was like politics because it often ends up in a scrum. This unfortunate mix-up is unlikely to change her view.
A bronze cast of The Thinker by the French sculptor Auguste Rodin has sold at auction in Paris for more than £8 million. It's not the original, which dates back to around 1882, but one of more than 40 editions made during and after his lifetime. The sculpture, often described as Rodin's best, depicts a muscular man resting his elbow on his knee with his chin on his clenched fist. Tim Muffet reports.
Lost in thought, his muscles tense, he sits in a moment of deep concentration. The Thinker was originally called The Poet and was initially intended by Rodin to be the crowning element of another of his sculptures, The Gates of Hell. But in 1888, it was exhibited on its own and became an independent work. It's believed that the Thinker represents the Italian Renaissance philosopher Dante, although there's no physical resemblance. More than 40 bronze casts have been created. Some are smaller, some larger than the original. The one sold today is the same size as the first one. Annika Guntram is the vice president of Christie's in France.
This one is 71 centimeters high. During Rodin's lifetime, there were 17 of this size cast. In response to the commercial demand he had, he created reductions and enlargements. A lot of the enlargements, for example, which are almost 2 meters high, are seen in public places, such as even the Musée Rodin in the garden.
The cast sold today was from a private collection and was created in 1928, 11 years after Rodin's death. All posthumous casts of the Thinker must be approved by the Rodin Museum in Paris, the only authority allowed to determine whether or not a cast can be considered authentic.
The headlines again. A mother and stepfather will both serve almost 30 years in prison for the murder of their 5-year-old son, whose body was dumped in a river in Bridgend. A teenage boy was given a minimum of 15 years. Boris Johnson has pledged to increase defence spending so it reaches 2.5% of the total value of the UK economy by 2030. Ukraine says it has forced Russian soldiers to abandon Snake Island, which was captured on the first day of the war. Moscow claimed it had withdrawn as a goodwill gesture. A review of parliamentary rules has said MPs should not be allowed to bring babies into the Commons chamber for debates. The US Supreme Court has dealt a blow to President Biden's climate change policies by limiting the government's ability to regulate emissions from power plants. BBC News.
And the news was read for the last time by Zeb Soanes.